everyone. My name is Claudia Barlow, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a member of Impact Austin, and I serve on the Impact Austin Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee. If this is your first exposure to Impact Austin, let me give you a brief introduction. Impact Austin is a women's collective philanthropy group serving Central Texas. Since 2003, members of Impact Austin have invested $7.64 million in the Central Texas community through 99 high impact grants, which have benefited 81 nonprofits and their clients. If you're interested in joining Impact Austin, you can get more information about membership on the Impact Austin website. If cost is a barrier, please don't let that deter you. Reach out to us and we'll find a way to make it work. A commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is core to Impact Austin. It's a fundamental thread which is woven into our mission, our values, and it's also clearly reflected in our strategic plan, from our focus on cultivating an inclusive and diverse membership to championing a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging within the organization, to advancing equity in the community through our grants, as well as our partnership within Central Texas. I joined Impact Austin about a year ago, and I very quickly joined the DEIB committee. I've really appreciated the opportunity to make a difference in an area that's important to me personally, while also leveraging my professional expertise as a senior HR executive at Accenture. I'm really pleased to welcome you today to the latest in our continuing series of educational webinars for Impact Austin members, as well as other interested participants. If you missed our earlier webinars, which covered topics ranging from racial equity to generational biases to equity for people of differing abilities, they're all available for replay on our Impact Austin YouTube channel. Today's session is focused on insights in LGBTQ plus equity in philanthropy. Just a few reminders before I introduce you to our panel. You can use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and Carrie, Maher, a fellow member and the lead of our DEIB Learning Subcommittee, will facilitate a Q&A later in the hour. We're also recording today's webinar, and it'll be posted on our webpage and the YouTube channel, so look out for that and share it with anybody who you think might be interested in watching the replay or who was unable to attend. So I'm thrilled today, Christina Gorczynski, Impact Austin's Executive Director, is going to be facilitating a great discussion with Ryn Gonzales, Priscilla Hale, and Tariq Daniels. I'll turn it over to Christina now, who will kick us off and introduce our panel members.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you to the DEIB Learning Subcommittee of Impact Austin. I am so proud of this organization for focusing on all the many ways that individuals can bring diverse backgrounds to the table, especially here at Impact Austin. So I'm Christina Gorczynski. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of Impact Austin. So I wanted to start off with just a note about pronouns to get us all grounded in the same place. We're going to kick off some visuals here for you. So I wanted to start off by giving you a moment about the importance of pronouns. Pronouns are one of the ways we portray our identities, and in this case, our gender identity. So when someone asks you to use their pronouns, they're asking you to respect their identity. Also, just practically speaking, when a person shares their pronouns, they are naming the pronoun in which they want to be referred in the third person singular. So when referring to that person while talking to someone else. Next slide. So we can quickly go through and have a quick English class and remember that when singular first person pronouns, you'll continue to use as is. So if someone lets you know that they use they, them pronouns, if that person speaks about themselves, they would still say, for example, I am a writer, wrote that book myself. Those ideas are mine. Do you like both me and my ideas? If they're speaking to you using singular second person pronouns, you would continue to do that as is as well. So you would say, you are a writer and wrote that book yourself. Those ideas are yours. I like both you and your ideas. So with singular third person pronouns, you would use appropriate as appropriate based on the pronouns the person being referred to uses. So if we go to the next slide, I can give you a quick example. So if someone says, like I just did, I use she, her pronouns, you would talk about me when I wasn't there as she is a writer and wrote that book herself. Those ideas are hers. I like both her and her ideas. If someone says I use he, him, it would be he is a writer and wrote that book himself. Those ideas are his. I like both him and his ideas. If someone asked for you to use they, them pronouns, you would say they are a writer and wrote that book themselves. Those ideas are theirs. I like both them and their ideas. So just quickly then to note on the they pronouns, we use them as singular. They refer to an individual, but just to make a quick note that the verbs are still conjugated the same with using plural. So you would still say they are versus they is. Also here, which I think is of note, is that the person would say, you would say themselves versus saying themselves. So the they here is used is singular. And the next slide, I believe, actually leave that slide alone. I wanted to just say something quickly about, okay, so if you don't know pronouns, well, one thing just to remember is that pronouns are not the most important thing in the world. And you can have a perfectly wonderful conversation without even using pronouns. So if you don't use pronouns, one idea would be to use that person's name where you would otherwise use pronouns. So in this case, you would say, Casey is a writer and wrote that book. Those ideas are Casey's. I like both Casey and Casey's ideas. Another tip is to use they, them pronouns until told otherwise. So if you don't know pronouns and you're, instead of using that person's name, unless told otherwise, one idea may be to use they pronouns until otherwise told. The other thing, if you don't know pronouns, introduce yourself with your own pronouns. So I would say I'm Christina, I use she, her, hers pronouns. You can introduce yourself with your pronouns, and that is a way of acknowledging pronouns. And it's a good signal to everyone that you meet that you are aware of gender, that you are supportive, and bottom line, that you're not making an assumption about that person's identity or about that person's pronouns. Practically speaking, using your own pronouns naturally prompts others to share pronouns without making it super awkward. And because of the privilege of, if you appear in a way that both fits your gender and your pronouns, taking that moment of privilege to acknowledge it. I know often personally, when I tell people I use she, her pronouns, I've had people receive that with like a little uncomfortable laugh and, oh, of course. But that's my way of making a point that I'm not going to ignore a situation where people are continuously using the wrong pronouns around me or not acknowledging the role that gender plays in most interactions that we have. So I've shared a couple of thoughts. By far, the most you will gain from this next 50 minutes is from our panelists. And I am so thrilled to introduce Ryn, Tariq, and Priscilla today. So I'll start off with Ryn. Ryn is a bigender speaker, educator, and advocate for the LGBTQIA+ community. Ryn is also a co-author of Trans Plus, Love, Sex, Romance, and Being You, a growing up guide for trans and non-binary youth. Ryn is the Operations and Programs Director at Out Youth. Out Youth is an Austin-based nonprofit that has served LGBTQIA+ youth for 31 years. Ryn has worked in the nonprofit sector, specifically in youth advocacy and organizing for 15 years. They have facilitated statewide youth lobby days, organized statewide conferences on youth leadership and empowerment, and created the Queer Youth Media Project. Welcome, Ryn. Priscilla Hale, so I'll welcome Priscilla now, is currently Executive Director of allgo, an organization celebrating and nurturing vibrant queer people of color communities in Texas and beyond through cultural arts, wellness, and social justice programming by supporting artists and artistic expression within our diverse communities. promoting health within a wellness model, and mobilizing and building coalitions among groups marginalized by race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, sexual identity in order to enact change. She has been with the organization since 1998 and has extensive experience in the areas of community organizing, refers to herself as not a workaholic, but she works a lot. And I'm sure that when Priscilla shares with you all of the programming development, implementation, nonprofit administration that she's done with allgo, you'll see how hard she definitely works. Tariq Daniels and I served on and I just realized, I'm so sorry, Tariq. So if anyone is editing this later, this is the part to cut, because I will be reading your bio in just a little bit when I reopen the tab that I just inadvertently closed. So I apologize for that. I'm going to welcome Ryn, Tariq, and Priscilla, and to go ahead and get started. So welcome to video, welcome your faces. And I wanted to kick off the program today by welcoming you to an Impact Austin space and reminding everyone here within Impact Austin, both members and otherwise, that one of our goals is to provide learning opportunities that will help provide insights in the grant making and giving, whether it's time, treasure, or talent, into the community. So our goal is to, with more education, means more informed giving and hopefully advancing a more equitable world. So let's get started. My first question, let's see. Before we get started on my questions, I actually want to introduce Ryn, and we're going to open up the next slide, and Ryn's going to do a quick exercise using the 4 boxes to get us grounded in a shared vocabulary.
Thanks, Christina. So this is the 4 boxes model, which we use at OutYouth, and we've also used in the book that Dr. Karen Wright and I wrote for trans and non-binary youth and all the people who love them. We use the 4 boxes to make sure that we are all on the same page when thinking about an individual, whether that's you or me, anyone on this panel, anyone that you might encounter in the world, because we all have all 4 of these. We all have an assigned sex at birth. So think all the way back when you emerged into the world, most likely, if you were raised in the United States and had the privilege of being born in a hospital with a doctor there, and even if you were born at home, I'm assuming somebody did this. They looked between your legs and made a determination. They assigned you a sex at birth. We all have a sexual orientation. That's who you want to go to bed with, who you want to do those, as we say it out, those sexy fun time things with. Gender identity is who you go to bed as and who you wake up in the world as. That's very internal. Your internal gender identities, like most identities, first start inside. But that's where we get into gender expression, who you want to be perceived as in the world. Now, it's important to understand that none of these must overlap or be connected in any way. So for example, we'll use me. I was assigned male at birth. My sexual orientation at various points in my life, depending on how I identified and how I expressed my gender, has been all over the map. People have assumed that I've been gay or straight, queer, asexual, everything in between. My gender identity has also changed over all of these years, and that process always starts on the inside. As a child, I went to bed. As a child, I guess, I don't know. Gender's hard and confusing. That's why I work at OutYouth, so that I can help youth figure it out too. Lately, I go to bed as a person who is bi-gender. I feel like I hold both ends of that gender spectrum inside me, while also acknowledging and holding that gender is not a spectrum, the whole universe. And there are 7, almost 8 billion people on this planet right now. There's that many gender identities on the planet as well, because all of our experiences of identity are singular. We just use these words to make them a little more understandable. And then my gender expression, how I want to be perceived in the world, changes all the time too. I put on a button-down shirt today, but last night I put on my favorite gigantic t-shirt to go to bed. My gender being perceived by my partner last night is entirely different than how you are probably perceiving my gender identity today. They're all interconnected and interrelated at the same time that they're not. So it's simply a reminder that you may encounter somebody who expresses their gender as male. Their gender identity may be female. And just because their gender expression is male doesn't necessarily mean that they're straight. And just because they express a male gender in the world doesn't mean that that was the sex that they were assigned at the beginning. So with that, I will leave it there and turn it back over to Christina.
Ryn, thank you so much. We'll be sharing this visual out as well. But as much as the visual says, I think that Ryn sharing their story is what I hope that our members leave with today. So Tariq, I get another bite at the apple to introduce Tariq Daniels. Tariq Daniels is an Afro-queer writer, performer, and mental health and HIV awareness activist. Tariq is the founder and executive director of WhatsintheMirror, a social movement that provides mental health awareness and suicide prevention through arts and advocacy to communities of color. He is serving his second term as a city commissioner for Austin's LGBTQ Quality of Life Advisory Board and HIV Planning Council. Tariq has written, directed, and produced several plays and released a novel, No Bonds So Strong, in 2018, and hosts a Black queer lifestyle podcast, What Works for Us. He is the winner of the 2019 Austin Under 40 Award in Arts and Entertainment and South by Southwest Community Service Award honoree in 2020. So without further ado, I am thrilled to bring on our panelists and go ahead and get started. I'm going to open up with a question, and I think that we're hoping that this conversation can flow naturally between the three of y'all. And I hope folks are out taking notes and have open ears to listen. So the first question is, what are the top issues impacting the LGBTQ community that you'd like to share from our for our Central Texas focus? And I can go ahead and I think Tariq, since I introduced you last, can I bring you on first?
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, that's such a loaded question when you think about that. I guess from my perspective and the work that I kind of champion, I would say definitely anything around mental wellness services. It's a huge topic and concern when we talk about, raising funds or talk about really allocating funds or really having a place where mental health is a priority or accessible to our community. Whether we're talking about peer support right now, it's a big push for me and my work to push peer support as a mental health peer specialist. And because I do believe that that is a way that we can move the needle forward around accessing mental health services. Of course, mental wellness services would include therapy, support groups, counseling and all of those things, but also want to be a champion for peer support as well. But of course, the things that impact our community, homelessness, I'm also someone who really bring HIV awareness to the forefront. I know that we've been dealing with the HIV epidemic for 40 years now, but it's still something that is impacting our community, especially in the South. We still have Black, queer, Latino, trans and queer folks still leading the the epidemic as far as new diagnosis in the South. So definitely when I think about it, I think about mental health services, I think about HIV services and awareness and moving that epidemic and ending HIV and mental health stigma. And of course, when we talk about queer, homelessness, right? You can't talk about that enough. So those are some of the things I think it's really impacted our community right now.
Thank you so much, Tariq. And Priscilla or Ryn, if either one of you wants to jump in here on this, either one of you can take it away.
Yeah, I'll just add, thank you. Welcome everybody. And so I think when I think about top issues, I have to think about racism and systemic racism, because if we don't start there, then we can't look at, and what we know is that systemic and racism impacts social determinants of health, which are all the things that Tariq just mentioned, and many more, and some more. And so if we don't begin there and understanding, because we can have all the mental health services in the world available to us, we already know that there is access to HIV and AIDS, medication, care, but there's that nuance piece of how systemic racism plays a part in not providing the best services. And so therefore, yes, everything has to come from a racial justice lens. And so when I think about that, it impacts everything. And so we must look at all the ways, and because what'll happen is folks then say, well, there's this and there's that, and this is available. But when you look and delve into that deeper, you see the inequities and the lack of access. And I don't mean access in like, I have health insurance or I don't have health insurance, so I can't go. In my world, I have health insurance, but the racism and the discrimination that I experience as a Black queer person trying to get care is, it keeps me from wanting to go and keeps me from being able to go. And that is access. And so you can't just put access upon me. Access has to be upon the folks in which we're seeking it from, and what are the barriers that are being put there. So I think particularly, that's the work I do, but also moving through the world as a Black person, you see me as Black first, and then you might say, oh, they're queer. That kind of thing. And so I think we have to definitely think about the ways in which racial inequalities, racism impacts all the issues of LGBTQ folks disproportionately.
I really appreciate everything that you just shared, Priscilla. And I know one note is that our Impact Austin members currently are reviewing grants in our health and well-being focus area. So I think it's especially timely for y'all to be bringing these issues and raising them up to the forefront. And Ryn, I'd love to know what you'd like to bring in.
I'm going to echo Priscilla, because that exact thing was the #1 highlight in the LGBTQ quality of life study that the city of Austin released on Monday, which was taken by over 2,000 community members. And it is very clear that the single biggest issue, the deepest entrenched issue in our community, is racism and the lack of access to resources, specifically for Black trans women, but Black queer people in general in Austin. That expands into a couple of areas that I'm not sure that the city is ready to have a conversation about, based on other conversations that I've been part of. Affordability, housing, all of those things keep coming up, and housing is something that should be a fundamental human right. But the point that I continue to make is that it's all well and good for us to have a study that points at all sorts of recommendations, like increased programming for our community in parks and recreation, better representation in the library collection, increased data collection across the city, and on and on. But my point remains the same. We did this study, but if people continue to be pushed out of the city, if gentrification continues unchecked, if large corporations are allowed to come in and pillage and raise our housing prices to where no one can live here anymore, what good does it for us to do anything in the study that has been requested by people who will no longer live here? So there's lots going on, and it does start at fundamental base inequity that must be addressed. Now, the other thing that I have to say, because of where I work and my dear friend Charles Curry, a lot of the focus in the LGBTQ space, especially in funding, and I am guilty of this as well. This is not attempting to place blame on anyone. I still deal with this mental model, right? When somebody says to me, the LGBTQ community, I think of people who are probably cisgender, white, and gay or lesbian. Not even queer, just like you're stuck. Well, I'm gonna get in trouble for this at work. Your stock photo white gay people. But that leaves out not only what we've already been talking about, but also our youth and also our elders. Because what Tariq brought up is really important too. The HIV epidemic has not gone anywhere. But what did go somewhere is an entire generation of our people. And because they went away, a lot of the issues that face aging queer people have not been addressed before and not been addressed well. So there's still a lot of work to do there for our elders. And I will just do a plug for our youth because I hear it all the time. Oh my gosh, the youth today are so lucky. They have it so easy. It must be so much. I don't know if you've been watching what's been happening at the legislature all year, but they are attempting to legislate trans kids out of existence. Governor Abbott has threatened to take executive action to make it illegal for trans kids to get any kind of medical care. And there's often this misunderstanding. It's like, oh, well, he just means like hormones and kids shouldn't be able to have surgeries until they're 18. No, not even therapy, nothing affirming. There's so much going on and we are still under attack. And we brought this up in our practice session the other day, didn't we? That, you know, we said this was going to happen in 2015. The Supreme Court said all the gays can get married now. All of our work is done. No. Being able to get married doesn't keep my trans kids safe. Being able to get married doesn't help the older queer person who is terrified to go into an assisted living facility. Gay marriage certainly didn't make racism go away. Like there's all of these things that continue to happen and we're missing it because our focus continues to drift back to, well, what does the middle-aged white guy need? A lot of work to be done.
I really thank the universe that y'all are doing this work, because I think that it is, I think it needs to be done. I think it needs to be funded. I think this stuff needs to be taken seriously. So thank you for bringing this work to the forefront, not just for doing it. A personal hero, Audre Lorde, said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So with that, of course, the question that I have to ask this crowd is about your thoughts on diversity and intersectionality within the LGBTQ community. And I think intersectionality was raised before, but I think we can go ahead and use Kimberly Crenshaw's term and ground ourselves in intersectionality. So I think Priscilla, you opened the door for this. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you first if you'd like to talk a little bit more about intersectionality within the community and how you think it shows up in your work. And as you said, in some of the social, health, education, economic outcomes for folks.
Yes. So again, as I said, leading with the racial justice lens, and I will say that my firm belief is that any work that is not, that doesn't lead from a racial justice lens is harmful, right? It is absolute, and people don't recognize that, and it's harmful because you're discounting what we know is true to be many barriers and many ways in which we are not well and can't be well regardless. And the places are, it doesn't matter about our income or anything, our income or our education, we are still experiencing the many places. And so you have to think about diversity and intersectionality at every point. You have to look at me, you have to say, okay, and when I think of diversity, I think of age, I think of income, I think of transgender folks, and Ryn spoke to this just a little bit around community, and we use the word communities, because even within the allgo community of queer people of color, we know that there are such vast differences between some of our folks who are immigrants have much more issues to deal with in terms of what it is that they're able to do and seek and how they live their lives, their safety, the violence, as well as and the same thing with Black trans women. We can't just be like, okay, they're Black, so therefore they fit into the category of what other Black folks are experiencing. And so it has to be nuanced. And a lot of folks who are in decision-making places often take this very narrow view about communities, and also, like Black folks, Latino folks, like this is what is happening, like that. And you have to be more nuanced than that, because otherwise you are going to participate in the continuous harm that is done to communities without that, what I call a more critical analysis of what is happening. And that requires all of us doing our work to look at who is coming, who are we reaching out to, when folks are not participating, why is that? At allgo, we're very open to like, what is happening if people with children are not coming? What does that mean? Are we holding things at a time when they don't have care? Are we holding things at a time when with transportation, can you get there? So that's how I think of diversity. Also like in its most complex but simplistic ways, to ensure that we are all included in that. And so I know that, my philosophy and our philosophy is, if we take care of the folks who are most marginalized, everybody else gets taken care of. It's not this thing of like where something's going to be taken away from folks, which is often the idea, is that people think they'll have to give up something, they'll have to lose something. And it's like, actually, if the most marginalized folks are taking care of, everybody wins. And so I want to just encourage us always to be thinking about our communities. And I know that sometimes what makes that difficult is that when I say you, I'm talking broadly, folks are not moving in circles where they are in contact with folks who are having these experiences, right? Like they don't know anybody who's this. I mean, I've been in this community for a long time, and I know some funders who said to me, I actually don't know a Black trans woman. And these are queer folks. And I was like, You know, like, okay. And so that's telling, right? And you're a funder and you're making funds, but you actually have no connection to the communities. And so therefore you cannot make sound or good decisions about what might be necessary because you can't even imagine their lives or what's happening. So again, yes, definitely around diversity and intersectionality, and our communities have a lot of work to do, particularly around making sure gender diverse and trans folks are included, and not just included, but uplifted, and that folks lead the way on all the issues that are impacting their lives, when we have a platform, that we follow that lead, even as folks who are in the community. Like, we need to follow that lead, and so everybody else does too, and to trust that.
Word, I don't know, and in a short, I'm just gonna say word, and give everyone a moment for your words to land. And then ask either Ryn or Tariq if you'd like to share your experience with intersectionality and diversity within the communities.
Yeah, I can really just, piggyback after Priscilla. Yeah, Priscilla, you definitely said it all. I was in a meeting last night led by Tiami Jackson, a Black trans woman from the Transgender Law Center now. That's where she works now. And she brought up the Black Trans Liberation Movement, and it was it's a motto. And this motto, and it just goes straight to what Priscilla was saying. This motto, if we can use the Black Trans Liberation Movement as a motto, so many other marginalized communities would be able to benefit from that. Like, we will all be able to move forward in all the inequities that we are talking about here. We usually talk about. When I think of intersectionality, I think of like the healing justice model, that like what I do at WhatsintheMirror and what I do in my own personal life, that leads always with a racial justice lens. It just has to start there, and all the work. And if you're leading with that model, you understand that there is no one size fit all when we're trying to have a liberation movement, right? Like, we could take a model and apply it to all of our different walks of life. And I just think about when, like at WhatsintheMirror, for example, like I can have a program like Connect to Care, but I felt it was important that if I wanted a program to promote wellness, I needed to move further into that. Like, well, who's not getting enough support around mental wellness? What community within the LGBTQ community that I can go further into? And then that's when we came up with Trans Connect, right? It's important to provide services and programs for more than just a general population. We are not all the same. To get to healing for a Black woman, cisgender, is not the same healing process for a Black trans woman or for a cis queer man. And you have to have that perspective, right? You have to understand that intersectionality is important if you're really trying to get to liberation. And so, I mean, Priscilla said it all in that way, but I just really wanted to bring that home, that there is no one size fit all motto when we're trying to liberate a community that have often been marginalized in so many sectors, through health disparities, through, so many social determinations. So healing justice and community, and really honing in on individual liberation that will be for the greater cause of the whole communities, as Priscilla would say.
Thank you so much, Tariq. Nobody's free until everybody's free. That's Fannie Lou Hamer, I think. Ryn, did you want to get in here?
Yeah. So specifically speaking to all the white people on the call, one of the things I'm proudest of is the quality of life study, is that we insisted two things: that it be grounded in an equity framework and intersectional framework that it led with race as the single most important determinant of quality of life. And it did. And the second thing that I discovered, got a lot of pushback for centering a quality of life study for the queer community on race. But this is why I want to address the white people in the audience in particular. You know that you are starting, at least, to do your work correctly when white supremacy pops up and says, why are you doing this? Why is this centered on race? That's when you know that you're doing it right. And it's very uncomfortable. I have to own that as a white person too. None of this work is comfortable. And often what I hear in my work is, especially from youth who have come from certain backgrounds, that I didn't do any of this. This isn't my fault. My family didn't do X, Y, Z. I don't care. Intent is entirely different than impact. It's what we teach our youth all the time. Your intent may be good, but if the impact is harm, then the harm must be addressed. And we are chock full of harm everywhere we turn. So the intersectional nature of the work, it must start there. And what I love about always being on a panel with Priscilla is that she always reminds me that I'm still not doing it quite right. But it's a reminder to continue trying. We had a wonderful conversation about implicit bias with our youth on Wednesday night. And the modeling that we can do for our youth is directly impacting the future that we are building. To have a youth fumble and stumble and admit that it was all too much and overwhelming is the first step, for us at least. So let's go back to this idea of a table. Like, looking at who is not at the table is still the wrong question. I mean, it's a good question. Still admittedly the wrong question. If you look around your table and notice who's not there and then pull up a chair, I mean, it's better. You're still not asking the right question. Why weren't they there in the first place? And even beyond that, who wants to be invited to the party late? That doesn't feel good. I know that to be true because I had that experience with the commission when during the last census, the census showed up like 3 months before the census was over, and it's like, oh gosh, we forgot to include queer people in the. That doesn't feel good. No one wants to be left out. So yes, if the table has already been set, figure out who is not there and figure out how to remedy that. But know that the next time that you set a table, you might want to look at the invite list first. And even more difficult for white people, you need to be asking yourself if you should even be the one setting the table in the first place.
Word again, and thank you for the correction. I've personally been navigating this, and I would like to A, stand corrected, and B, because I wrote that in the chat for people who are just listening. I wrote to think about who's not at the table of Impact Austin. And here's what I feel like navigating, especially in my role with my own identity, is when people say they don't want to offend anyone. Like, if you start to point out who's not at the table, that's one question that I feel is like a safe one to ask sometimes. But then asking like, how did this table get this way? I think is like when people are kind of like, whoa, like, let's kind of pivot to be like, how are we going to make a bigger table? I'm all down for the table. I don't even need to be at the table. So I know we've got time for Q&A, but I'd take a moment of just privilege to ask, how do I shut that down? What do I do? I mean, when someone says they don't want to offend somebody, I'm like, we kind of got to start somewhere on some of this stuff, y'all. What have y'all said in the face of that? Anybody can share, and then I think we can go to Q&A, because I think some folks are wanting to talk about how to use this, some of this framework in our grant making. But I think it would benefit the organization itself if you could just speak to what to say when someone says they don't want to offend someone.
Christina, can you clarify who's saying they don't want to offend somebody?
People, when you bring up that tables, so you start to bring up the table and bring up that folks aren't at the table, or that like the table's looking really homogenous. Sometimes I have found resistance to wanting to even have that conversation because they don't want to offend the people who are already there, or the people who said it and made the guest list in the first place. So we don't have to answer that question. We can talk about that offline and we go to like therapy together. But if anyone wanted to have a word of wisdom, if you're talking to a wonderful group of funders, super generous women and individuals in our organization, if you could just say something, if anyone has the word to say.
Yeah, I of course, immediately I think about, you know, then it makes you look at yourself, right? And I think that's what you're seeing, is that when you say that, it's like, but, you know, Ryn talked about, you know, me, them not doing it right, right? Like, I know that there are things that I'm not doing right. And so what that means though, is that I'm open. And that might mean that I have to step back 5 steps. I might have to get up from the table. And the thing is if I'm about the work, I will get up from the table to make the work happen. You have to know, like, at the root of it, what are you there for? And can I still be at the table and bring my money and bring my gifts, whatever that is, without sitting at the actual table? I mean, at my house, everybody can't fit around the table, but everybody's in the house. Some people got to sit in the living room and eat at TV trays. But that don't mean that doesn't mean that you're not part of that. Is the elders are at the table, right? But you have to understand, what does that mean and what does that look like? And if you're not willing to actually kind of be behind the scenes for work to happen, I question your commitment to the work. And I would have to, you know, have that conversation. Now, of course, it's going to make people uncomfortable. But what about those of us who are being impacted by not being at that table, by having work be funded that it actually is not impacting us, or that actually ends up creating harm? Because there's a lot of stuff that people are doing that are creating harm to us. From policies, from rules, from regulations, from everything. And they're like, oh, we thought this was a good thing. But then it comes back to where it's actually hurting queer people of color communities more than it is benefiting. And so it's hard to have, but we got to have it. And if you don't want to have it, I mean, sometimes you got to shake the whole damn thing up. You got to shake it all up. And I'm willing to shake it up, you know, but I'm also willing personally to get out of the way.
I'm going to jump right in there, Priscilla, because you and I had the same thought. Well, one, I have to own that I'm an introvert, so I rarely want to be at the party anyway. But that does not mean that I am just going to uninvite myself from the party and leave. Like, that is an option. And it's been pointed out in the chat that the hesitancy stems from the idea of inadvertently protecting white supremacist standards. So I know that your question was, how do I interrupt the offense? But first, I'm going to take us all back to 7-year-old me. I studied Taekwondo for over a decade, and 7-year-old me sitting in class one day, and Rhonda walks out, the instructor, and she said, okay, today we are going to learn to protect ourselves from knife attacks. That's 7. So she's got 7-year-olds sitting around and she's like, what's the first thing you do when somebody pulls a knife on you? Of course, a bunch of 7-year-olds scream, run away, kick them. The very first thing that she taught us to do was remind ourselves that we are about to get cut. It's statistically improbable to have a knife pulled on you and to not get cut, right? So what she was preparing us for was to survive. I have to go into these conversations knowing that I'm going to get cut, I am going to get offended. But because I was aware of it ahead of time, I'm not distracted by it. It does not offend my ego. It does not make me want to stand up and storm away. It's the most important part to me in my anti-racist work. Like, I know I'm not getting out of this unscathed. I know I think and do all sorts of racist shit all the time, consciously and unconsciously, because of the society I was raised in and the family that I came from. Like, people who are offended, you must remind yourself, especially in this context, remind yourself of 2 things then. They are actively defending white supremacy, whether they know they are or not. And 2, if they're offended, you're doing it right. Now, does that mean that they all get up and walk away from the table with all of their money and stuff? Yeah, maybe. And then what do? We get to set the table again, but the right way. Well, a righter way. Never really a believer, and there's one correct way to do anything, but.
Y'all are incredible. Y'all are like picking up the Etch-a-Sketch that I used to get and play with, and y'all are like shaking the Etch-a-Sketch and being like, we're gonna draw a whole new world. Like, it's really incredible to hear from y'all. And I know there may be some questions out there for folks. So Carrie, Maher, who is the co-chair of our DEIB Learning Subcommittee, is going to come on, facilitate a little bit of Q&A. And I think y'all are, again, I'm going to remind you, you're talking to a group of people who have resources to allocate. Say you are continuing to say what you're here to say. And I really do think y'all are making an impact today. So thank you again for being here. And thank you, Carrie.
100%. Thank you all so much. I'm seeing the comments flood through to the impact of this authenticity in our session today. I'd like to actually start with Carmelita's question. She asked if we could address the notion of a quick fix for equity and inclusion work to correct the power imbalance in an organization.
Just real quick, I don't think it's a quick fix. I think it goes back to what Ryn was saying. Like, in most organizations, the table has to be restarted, because if it's rooted in racial inequities, quick fix won't work in the long term. It would continue to show up. And you can put a band-aid, and then of course that band-aid will wear off and that sore will come right back, eventually. So I do believe that if you're in it for the long haul, and you have to be able to show up and do the work continuously. It's not a quick fix, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. I know, Ryn, you had brought up earlier the study, and there were a couple questions that were related to some of that. Harriet Reynolds had asked, and I think she was referring to the community. I don't know if she's still on, but she had asked how we move from implementation of what the data suggests to action, and what does that process look like?
So practically, And I appreciate, so I am going to start this with an appreciation. I appreciate our communities, thank you, Priscilla, and their eagerness to get going. The reason the study came about was because the commission is charged with advising City Council on matters related to quality of life for queer people in Austin, right? So we would make recommendations, we'd send them over to council, council would come back and say, this is great, how many people is this going to impact? And say, well, we don't know, there's no data, right? The city's not collecting sexual orientation, gender identity data. They're like, oh, well, you know, if we don't know how many people it's going to impact, it's really hard to implement. So what we started to do was when they would ask, we would say, it is going to impact everyone in Austin. To which their response was, are you implying that everyone in Austin is queer? And we'd say, yes. We'd say, well, that's not true. And we'd say, well, where's the data? Prove to me, right? So that's how we got a quality of life study in the first place. Where we go from here is taking what we knew anecdotally. We know these things. People with the lived experience know what they need. That's why we ask them in the first place, right? Or we do the whole Savior thing where we fly in with our capes and we wave our magic wands and give them things that they don't actually need. Because we want to do it because it makes us feel good and look better. There's a lot of excitement in the community to push forward with all of these things that we've known. And the hardest part for us right now is taking the study, all of the recommendations, all of the data, and then working with the community to prioritize them. Because right now, we've needed help for so long, all of it feels like it's on fire. All of it feels like they need to be addressed. But that's just not possible. And it's not practical. So where we are starting is with the data. The number one thing that I am pushing through is ensuring that the city is collecting sexual orientation, gender identity data in all ways, in all manners, in as safe a way as possible. Because if we are not represented in the data, then we are never considered.
Right.
And I'm tired of being forgotten. From there, then we address things like housing, affordability, gentrification, making sure that the people who took the survey can stay here long enough to reap the benefit of having participated in the survey in the first place. But even more practically, where do we start with this? Read the study, absorb it. I've never been prouder of a product of anything that I have been involved of in my entire life. And I work at Outyouth, y'all. I have a lot to be proud of. Over 30,000 kids all over the world. Absorb it. It's not perfect by any means, but it's the most perfect study of its kind that we think has ever been done. Because it centers all of the things that we've talked about today. And it's true that if you address the problems for those most in need, everyone else benefits.
I've got so many questions. I know we're running out of time that are related to the data. But as you're assessing this and prioritizing, there are two kind of questions in my head, and they are related to some other comments. But one is the LGBTQ plus communities that are addressing these needs and issues that we've already discussed through this session. As you're prioritizing those, what does the lens look like on collaboration, coalition building, so that the redundancies and the disparate resources that are provided are addressed and the gaps are addressed as well, that we're not working in silos and have duplicative services all over the place? Is that a part of the follow-up to this study?
Definitely. And again, we talked about table setting earlier. There's a reason why I'm so intent on table setting right now, plus the question of if there should even be a table in the first place, but we don't need to go into that philosophy conversation. We are going to be bringing together, the commission's role is to tell council where we want them to spend money. Let's just be very frank, that's our job. But it is not our job as a commission to dictate what those things are. It's our job to listen to the community. So we will be working with the community to bring them together around the things that they are most passionate about. And there will be commissioners present on these working groups and coalitions and task force, all of those things, certainly. But there's also this reminder that where you see duplication of services, that may not actually be the reality. Because of what Priscilla and Tariq have already brought up, we are not a monolith of a community. The needs of Black trans women in a therapist are entirely different than the needs of a 13-year-old gay boy who wants to come out at school. They're not the same.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good question to ask to make sure that we are investing in our communities wisely and not recreating wheels, but at the same time acknowledging that we must fundamentally understand the need.
Right. That makes sense. There was another data question I want to make sure I get to. Carolyn Tipton had said that Austin ISD is currently long-term planning with a focus on equity. They're using school and census data to map out underserved communities, then planning academics, facilities, sports, et cetera, for the next 10 years and the next bond vote based on this data. How do we properly include the LGBTQ plus students in this underserved group if their demographics aren't included in the school and census data, which I think is kind of a follow-up to you saying, getting that straight first. A follow-up to that, she says, is if we want to collect this data so that we can make sure that community is included and our efforts are measured, how do we do that in a respectful and age-appropriate way for school children, for school-age children? Priscilla, do you want to jump in on this one?
No, not really. I think, I have issues with data. And I think that's where I like to speak to grant making. So many things are dependent on numbers on a piece of paper. And what we know is there's no way you're ever going to be able to accurately or even get close to the number of queer youth to be able to give them that services. The LGBTQ quality of life had 2,000 participants. What we know is that there are many people who did not participate in that, right? And people of color, right? Even though the number this time was a little higher, there's still a lack of numbers in there. And so what we have to then do is figure out how to let folks' lived experiences speak to that without relying on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? kind of thing. Like we have to think more whole. And so that's my thing around when you have a whole, it's just kind of trying to shift the dynamic and the way in which funding and how people are believed about what is happening in their communities. And so so I don't know how you gather that data, particularly when you have so much discrimination and injustices, and you can't protect me from being harmed from either my parents or from my classmates. And so, no, I'm not going to tell you that, and I'm not going to show up to your thing where you're counting. I'm not going to do that because you cannot guarantee my life safety. I might have to go home somewhere where I might be kicked out or killed or whatever. And so you have to think of those nuances of why. I mean, even grown folks, right, are like, oh no, I can't do that because I can't be seen there. I mean, that is real. And we have to understand that if the environment is not safe, like I'm privileged. I'm privileged in so many ways. That don't mean that I don't think about the violence that can happen to me on a daily basis. But I also know that I don't have to worry about losing my job, my family, my kids, my parents. That is not something that I have to worry about. Fear of losing my life all the time, every day. So we can't just be like, why, people won't tell us, or they did tell us and the numbers were low. Because I think if you get the numbers will be off. And then you'll be like, well, it was relatively low, right? And then it won't give you it won't give the numbers that are needed for then people to say, oh yeah, we really need to do something about this. I want to know how many trans folks need to be hurt and harmed before we go, oh yeah, we really should put a lot of money into that, right? Without saying one is too many.
Right.
One is enough. That tells us something. And so I just say that because I'm like, the data thing throws me off a little bit, but I do think in terms of like funding and granting, that we have to try. I just want to talk about this because we're talking to Impact Austin, right? And it's, creating some systems where people can speak their story, tell their story in a way that maybe people who are doing grant funding don't quite get. So you have to have people who with lived experiences sitting there and reviewing those grants, but also think about different ways. What are ways in which I can tell the story of my life and our communities that we're working with that resonate? And if it doesn't resonate, then you have to, we get funding from some very progressive funders. Some of them, and what they'll do is they get folks who line up with us around being able to have a conversation. So it's not just the paper, because when people in philanthropic giving, there's a lot of barriers that go along with that. There's a lot of proving. And it's like, if I have to prove so much, it really is not worth my time to do that. Give us general operating support. Recognize that some of the ways in which funding is happening is creating barriers. I will tell you, I attended the Impact Austin information session about funding. And when I heard the depth and all of how competitive, I said, now how much of this is worth my time if I don't end up getting funded? I don't have the luxury as a small queer people of color organization to put this much time and energy into something where I may not get funded. And people will look at that and go, but you might have. And I'm like, no, everything I was hearing from people was like, I most likely won't. And so I also want to speak to that quick fix thing. I think there are some things that can be stopped. There might not be so there's some things that people can stop doing that are part of the fix, right? You might not be able to like shift the whole table right now, but there's something you can stop doing. Don't invite anybody else. Don't give any more funding. You did this funding, but some more funding is coming through. Change that next time. I know, and I know this because I know Impact Austin is doing a funding now. Something's coming up after that. So look at what didn't work now and then say, well, next time we do this funding, this is what we're going to do to make a balance of what things that we didn't do, right? And so, yeah, that's I'm done.
150%, Priscilla.
I have to piggyback on Priscilla and that whole mention of general operating funds. If I have to, oh my gosh. I love you all. I love funders. Funders pay my paycheck. I love it, right? I like getting paid. What drives me absolutely up the wall is an insistent, and admittedly, I am not in development, so I don't know near as much about Impact Austin or grant making or any of that than other folks either on the call or at Youth actually know. General operating funds, full stop. Because what we run into, I know, is people wanting to fund something new. We want to do something new. Like, well, yeah, that's nice, but we've been doing clinical services at Out Youth for 31 years, and we still have a wait list. It's like, can we just invest in the general operating funds to get to a point where we don't have a wait list anymore? Is that new and exciting shiny thing going to look really good in a press release and your name being associated with it going to be super cool? Definitely. But starting that new program when I have parents calling me every day in tears because their kid was bullied so bad at school that they tried to kill themselves and they ended up in a mental hospital and now are out and need ongoing therapy, and they can't find somebody who specializes in sexual orientation or gender identity therapy for a young person. That new idea is great. But what do I tell that mom? What do I tell the 3 different moms I had to call and have that conversation with last night? And that's not me exaggerating, you guys. 3 last night. And yes, Priscilla, thank you for the mention of stop. I love that idea. Keep, start, stop, and then fix it. The other thing I will add there is that oftentimes that quick fix is not possible. Unplugging it sometimes, the stop, definitely possible. But I like to remind folks that it took us hundreds of years to get here. To assume that we can undo it overnight or over a couple of years is entirely misguided and illogical. And it's also not on a single person to do it. Because when we assume that somebody else is going to do it, then nothing ever happens, right? So please fund general ops. Please fund general ops. Please fund general ops. It makes our lives so much easier. We already know what we are doing. We know what works. And I also agree with Priscilla. Thank you for that reminder. I love data when it deals with the city council, because now I know that I can get money because I've met their demands, which I also have to acknowledge is upholding a piece of white supremacy and that and show me the data. I absolutely hate it at work. Our development director is constantly asking me for data to prove to funders that we're actually doing what we do.
Did you see any of that lift during COVID at all?
Maybe a little, but what I think is more impactful, and I love this piece of what Priscilla said, you have to listen to the stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this to be true because I'm a storyteller by nature and training.
It lifted.
If I came to you, oh, go ahead.
I just want to say this real quick because funders, there's a lot of questions around funding. It did lift during COVID, but it caused strain on organizations because it was like all of a sudden people had money to throw at you, but they were like, we need you to do this in 3 months. And it's like, so did you think we were sitting around doing nothing? Like there was nothing on our calendar planned for the next 3 months, but you want to give us this money, but this means we got to do some extra thing.
Oh, and I have to pivot my business and all the things. Yeah, all the things like
pivot and add, pivot and add. And so it's like it lifted and like, well, here's some money, like, right? And what it made me feel like, particularly as a Black executive director, there was a lot of funds available for Black-led organizations, is that we became a commodity. We became a commodity. And yeah, and the thing is, the question for me was, so you had this money all along.
Mm-hmm.
What band, what did you jump on? Because if you can throw this money now, in February or January of 2020, why didn't you throw some money to me and Tariq then? Without us having to, like, there was money that we didn't even have to ask for. We didn't even have to go out and get. We didn't have to apply for. And that tells us that money is not the issue.
mm-hmm.
There's something else at play here, right? Which I sort of talked about that racial justice lens, because particularly after, you know, all the Black Lives Matter and all that, it was like, oh, we want to support. We'll you know, we want to do this. And it's like, but, and so it was like, is this real? Or is this about some kind of face for you to say that you've done this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And so don't treat us as a commodity, because I will tell you that allgo has turned down money before, because there's a way in which we will not give up our autonomy, but we also will not chase or sell ourselves for finances, because we have to be accountable to our communities. And if we gave up 90% of our funding in 2006 so that we could do the work that we needed to do for our communities that we knew would work, That's how important, and that's how much funding has to allow us to be who we are and to be autonomous, not to tell us that we need to partner with a more endowed organization or a white organization that has no understanding about our work, which we have been told. We also know that there's been organizations that have been told not to do things around using the word social justice, or they would lose their funding, that kind of thing. So yeah, let folks be autonomous in the work. And if you don't want to fund that, then just say that. We're good. I'm good. You know, I'm from the
And it
South.
saves us time.
This is the South.
Back to your original point.
Don't have me going, well, what's going on? Is it because blah, blah, blah? No, just tell us straight up. And then we don't have to waste our time, and we can go, they don't fund us. They don't support this work. And then be good with that and be okay with that.
Mm-hmm. Tariq, is there anything that you'd like to add to this, the last points, impact, the most impact that we can make aside from funding? I know we're almost 20 minutes over, so we do have to land the plane, but we'd love to carry on this conversation at another time, but parting words.
Yeah, just to follow Priscilla, allow the story, you know, the reporting and funding sometimes can be a huge barrier in wanting to do the work and knowing the work that you need to be done, but also getting a funder that is dictating how the work should land or what the end point of the work should be. And I do believe that you know, and I'm an artist, so it's always about the story with me. It's never really about, and that's why I'm always amazed how I even got into not like this depth of nonprofit and writing grants and stuff, because it's always about the story for me. It's always the hands-on. It's always the lived experience. It's never been data driven. I can use data to look at, to study, to be in the know, to be educated, but I'm moved by lived experience. I'm moved by being in community. I'm moved by the work that I see and know and hear that needs to be done. And I think funders should, you know, if you're moved to kind of put your money where your mouth is, it should be able to be just as fluid as that as well, right? Your your requirements should allow the people to do the work that is needed to be done and not tied down to, I'm just going to say it, white supremacy, a way of doing the work, right? It is other ways to fund and allow people to work in community than what we know it to be. We don't have to fund the way the city of Austin do their funding process. We don't have to fund, you can be different. You can be the different funder. You know, you don't have to follow what has been done in the past, because we know what has been done in the past has been harmful to marginalized communities and marginalized organizations that's trying to do the work. So be different. That's all. That's my biggest takeaway from that. You know, show up differently for the community that you're trying to fund.
It's a beautiful way to close out. I couldn't agree more. Thank you guys so much for being with us today, for informing our group. And if we have any other additional questions, I'll certainly let you know. As everyone knows, this is being recorded. So for those that may have missed it, please share, and we'll have that out to the community very shortly. So Ryn, Tariq, Priscilla, Christina, Claudia, Carolyn, thanks everybody for making this happen. And we really, really appreciate everything that you do here in Austin. Thanks, everyone.